Welcome to FOBtv, the future of business. I'm your host, Kevin Benedict, and I want to welcome each of you to the program today. We're going to talk about cybersecurity and everything related to cybersecurity in the context of healthcare systems today. I want to introduce both our guests today. We have Manan Kakar. He's Cybersecurity Executive Director at Providence. He has led enterprise-wide risk assessment, developed strategic roadmaps to move from reactive to proactive security and risk management. He has led the implementation of security initiatives to protect, detect, monitor, respond, and recover from security risk. Our second guest is Bob Scalise. He's managing partner for risk and cyber strategy here at TCS. He has nearly 30 years of experience building and leading IT, cyber, data security, and consulting teams for global organizations. I want to thank both you guys for being here today. Let me jump right in and just start us out by asking both of you the question. Manan, why don't we start with you? How does someone responsible for cybersecurity today sleep at night?
I think it's the way I think about this sleep as an aspect is like mental health is important, burnout is important. So there has to be some amount of just accepting that, yes, we are in a stressful job, but there has to be time that we carve out and we're like, hey, we're just going to disconnect, spend time with family, keep our phones away when we're in bed, not worry about those constant emails that we're getting. So that's kind of the tactical answer to the question. But honestly, just being in cybersecurity and just knowing how the workforce has changed over a course of one and a half year through COVID and all the different challenges that being remote brings in, I think from a cybersecurity perspective, whether it is somebody who's an analyst or whether it's a CISO, across the entire spectrum, I think everybody is just like thinking about all the other things that can go wrong. I think anybody in cybersecurity is just constantly just thinking about what could go wrong. Oh, can our AD fail? Is our website exposed? Is our Azure or cloud bucket exposed? It's just a constant amount of thought process that what's the next thing that could go wrong? And it's a good thing and a bad thing because, as you said, it does add to a lot of stress when we're trying to get change done or make things happen. Everybody's not working at the same pace. Not everybody understands and appreciates the risk the same way that somebody from cyber does. So those challenges do take a toll on somebody's physical and mental well-being. Yes, it is difficult to disconnect, but I think we've all started to build that muscle of being like, hey, yes, this is constant risk. The risk is going to remain there tomorrow. It's not going to change. Let's get ourselves rested, and then we pick up where we are tomorrow morning. So I think that's kind of a more realistic approach that I think we often talk about within our cyber community.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Bob, what about you? In a consulting role, you're working with all kinds of different clients. So it's almost a multiple of that.
Yeah, I mean, as Manan was talking, I'm thinking like, who actually sleeps at night? That was my first reaction when you hear about it from a client's perspective of the constant threats and the challenges they're facing. I guess I probably think of it in disconnecting, or at least how do you not be thinking about this 24/7, right? Probably three things, right? I think the first thing is just you've got to have an eagerness to learn in this space. When you're dealing with technology and the cyber threats facing them, you've just got to be always willing to stay on top. The domain is constantly evolving, and you've got to kind of be a lifelong learner. So I think, first thing, preparing yourself with that knowledge kind of leads to my second point of just, I guess, being prepared to steal from my Boy Scout days. If you're organized, if you're methodical, if you've kind of gone through as much preparation as you can, and you recognize it's not necessarily a losing battle, right? Taking those precautionary steps can actually, in fact, mitigate risk. So it's not a lost cause. It's not, all for naught if you're spending time preparing. And I guess the third thing, it kind of echoes a little bit of what Manan was saying. To me, it's about humility and kind of being humble, knowing that no matter despite our best efforts, there's going to be, a data breach. The bad actors are always kind of changing their tactics. They only have to be successful once. We've got to be successful all the time. But if you're prepared, again, you can kind of mitigate some of that damage. So I think, those are kind of I've been in a position of leading a security team in industry. So I haven't, spent my entire career in consulting. So I kind of get that risk, and that's kind of how I think about it. So.
I think that's very important. I think the aspect of being prepared, like we need to spend our time that we are not sleeping. How do we prepare ourselves better? How do we make sure that our operations teams have round the clock coverage, whether it is through different time zones or some other shifts, but we have to make sure that we set a framework that allows people to be effective and be available. Like there will always be there's something called as the follow the sun model. We can have some operations in the US, some operations in India, some operations in Europe. And if you have this follow the sun model, and if you are prepared, and if you have the teams trained, or you at least keep training your people, it does take the edge off a little bit, that you have to have faith in the teams that, things are going to go bad at some point of time. Something is going to go wrong. If we feel that our teams are prepared to respond, then it does help anybody in the cyber organization or the organization at large, like CIOs, CEOs. They have to address the same question. How do they sleep? Like they've got other risks to handle as well. So I think preparation is absolutely key. If we spend the hours that we are awake to prepare ourselves, then I think we get through it. But I think everybody should take time out to sleep. Mental health is very important in the job we do. We should all be able to disconnect and come back recharged the next day.
So Manan, how have you seen cyber attacks and the threat landscape evolve in healthcare over the past 5 years? In what ways has it changed?
I think one of the big differences, like having come from consulting and being in situations where we are dealing with multiple clients who have different kind of threats, different kind of maturity, and everybody's dealing with a variety of threats, and then coming to Providence and just kind of being focused in this healthcare space, what I've realized is over the last 5 years, a lot of healthcare organizations have embarked on this digital journey. Now, as we've embarked on this digital journey, it comes with how do we make sure that the patients and the healthcare providers, the frontline caregivers, as we call in Providence, the frontline healthcare providers, how do they have access to the systems? How do we reduce friction for them? And as we start thinking about this, like new technologies coming in, hospitals and regions trying different technologies, and more internet connected devices in the hospitals itself, the threat landscape has changed quite a bit in terms of there's more to go after. Like there are more points of failure from a cybersecurity perspective. And obviously in the last 2 years, the challenge has been that because there is this aspect of not everybody is physically present. If there are incidents, I know of stories where a lot of healthcare organizations have had to be like, well, we just turned this entire closet or section off of the hospital because we weren't using it during the pandemic. And now suddenly we have. So people are turning on the computers and the systems, and suddenly there are older viruses that still exist. And then we are in this mitigation situation. So I think what's happened is the threat landscape has increased because of digital initiatives and so on and so forth. Cloud has brought in a whole set of new challenges. And then there is this old legacy technology that we have that when people turn on and suddenly we start getting like pings about WannaCry, and we're like, how did this happen? So the points of failure have, from my perspective, drastically increased for healthcare. And on the other side, it's been between nation state and just notorious folks who just want to cause disruption. They've realized that, they can go after healthcare, and there is no principle in a way to say that, hey, we're not going to go after healthcare, we'll go after something else. But it's just like, doesn't matter, we want to cause chaos, we'll go after whoever we can find. We know there are healthcare companies who've been ransomware, and it constantly keeps happening. So points of failure have increased. partly because of digital initiatives, partly because of the pace of change that is happening. I think COVID hasn't really helped the IT and cyber teams be as prepared for this change that has happened at the pace it has.
Thanks for Manan. So Bob, let me just ask you this. How important is it to have resilience built into your critical IT systems? That word seems to pop up in every conversation we have, resilience, resilience. What does that actually look like?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, right? Breaches are going to happen. They're bound to occur. So I think it's important to have the plans and the processes, I would call it the governance, right? The governance structure that can help you and help an organization minimize the impact and then recover from, whatever that cyber incident might be. I think the biggest elements, right? It begins with the most senior levels of the organization. And by that, I mean C-suite, board of directors, key technology leadership. And the way you do that, right? You make it clear through policies, you make it clear through funding. Where you spend your money is an indication of your priorities. And then you make it clear through what you measure and what your metrics are, that cyber resilience is a high priority for us. How quickly, well, first of all, how much we can mitigate an attack, and then how quickly we can recover from one and minimize the impact of one. You put measures and metrics around that, you give it the right funding, and you put the right policies in place. And that's at the highest level. That's what we look for in a cyber resilience program.
So Manan, is healthcare any different than other industries, or are there some unique aspects to it that makes it different?
I think every industry has its unique aspects to it. If we think about the finance, which is typically at the forefront of technology adoption and cybersecurity, so on and so forth, I think the challenge that healthcare presents is similar to what you would expect in some of the other industries, but it's a little bit more pronounced, is because from a healthcare perspective, if we think about it, not everybody's a technologist in healthcare. Like at the end of the day, what healthcare provider organizations are there for is frontline patient care. That means we've got doctors, we've got nurses that are operating in intense environments and fast-paced environments, and technology is an enabler for them. Technology allows them to do certain things that helps them achieve whatever they're doing for patient care. So what ends up happening is, in those situations, we have to always think about how do we reduce the friction for a healthcare provider, for a doctor or a nurse. How do we reduce the friction provided by technology from a security perspective? How do we reduce that, but keep a level of risk mitigation in place and also allow them to provide healthcare faster and better? We're supposed to be an enabler to that. So what ends up happening is, because of that, if we think about it, like whether it is a physical ID or it is a multi-factor authentication ping, or it is locking down a computer terminal in a hospital facility, we have to always keep in mind that, is it going to be possible for a doctor or a nurse who's not a technologist? It's very difficult for us in the technology field to kind of separate our ability to be like, hey, I see this error, I can make some sense of it and I can work around it. But that's not what a doctor and a nurse should be focused on. They are there for providing fast healthcare and safety and do what they're supposed to do. So how do we manage risk in terms of that construct? Still provide cybersecurity, but don't inhibit them from providing the care that they have to. That's the struggle in cybersecurity in healthcare, and it's nuanced because lives are at stake. If we were to say that hey, this computer somebody cannot log into this computer because the MFA multi-factor ping did not come on the phone, or they didn't have the phone, and they have somebody who needs immediate medical attention, the stakes are different. Sure, we can say that a $1 billion deal did not close because a finance guy did not click the right button because he was logged out of his system. Sure, the stakes are high, but to me, in healthcare, when lives are at stake, it's things and conversations change. So that's the challenge in healthcare cybersecurity. That's the uniqueness, that at the end of the day, whatever we do, we have to protect our patients. We have to protect our doctors and nurses and our employee base from cybersecurity breach. But we always have to make sure that patient care is not inhibited in any way for any sort of cybersecurity control that we put. Like, it's just against the business, against what we're supposed to be doing. So that becomes very unique and challenging for us to. Organizations have tried to roll out multi-factor. There's a huge learning curve to it. There is something where somebody's like, hey, now I have to use one of my hands to bring out my phone, do a Face ID, hit approve, and then I get into my system. Whereas I should be like, writing down notes about the patient. So those challenges are very unique if we think about it from like, who's our customer? Our customer is the patient and the healthcare provider that's helping them. So that focus really makes healthcare a very unique challenge in my perspective.
The next question I'm going to address to both Bob and Manan here. If we look back to the kind of the advent or the early stages of the internet, and we would read about hackers, I remember going out and buying all the first kind of books on hackers and the stories around hackers and how, the police tracked down various hackers that had caused problems. But those were usually kind of loners, isolated incidents with a club or a group of teenagers that were just seeing what was possible and creating some havoc. Today, organizations like Providence and just about all kinds of different organizations find themselves face to face with nation states and military sponsored attacks against individual commercial enterprises. I mean, how does a commercial enterprise resist or address attacks by nation states?
Yeah, I think times have changed, haven't they? So as you mentioned, right? I mean, we know that nation states sponsor cyber terrorism. There's, the APT threat from the Lazarus Group, which is associated with North Korea. I mean, they would go on and on. There's lists and lists of them. And we also know that there's, non-nation state cyber criminal groups that have developed very sophisticated types of attacks and capabilities. I mean, they're doing this, in part because of the whole proliferation of cyber tools that you can buy in dark web marketplaces. And partly they're organizing like businesses and business enterprises. So, the combination of the technology and the organization is making them very effective. I think defending against either of them requires some of that same prioritization and the preparation and everything that we talked about earlier. I mean, if I had to think of, a couple key things, right? It's knowing your IT assets. Manan talked about, shutting off whole parts of networks for a year or two because of COVID and then bringing them back online and nobody thinking, at least of the implications of that, right? But knowing your assets, knowing the vulnerabilities of those assets, and either being able to manage and minimize those vulnerabilities or wrap some level of protections around them for a period of time. Knowing how everything in your environment's connected to your enterprise operations, whether it's IT, OT, IoT, and we can talk about IoT too. I mean, it is scary when you think about the convergence of physical and virtual world there, and and how lives are at stake. Ensuring everyone knows their role and responsibility in cyber resilience. We talked about resilience a few minutes ago, right? But what's everyone's role in a resilience program, and how do you respond? Right? How do you practice those exercises and knowing, muscle memory of knowing how to respond? The other thing I guess I'd probably say is, information sharing organizations exist, right? The bad guys talk to each other. They share information on targets all the time. And more we're starting to see industries and companies realizing my competitor is somebody I need to share some of this information with. So those information sharing organizations and the constructs that, sometimes requires government to get involved to facilitate the risk around that, is important. And then, at the end of the day, you've got to have good relationships with law enforcement so that, you where to turn and they know you when you do have an issue. So I that's how if I had to tell somebody at a high level how to kind of address those risks, whether it's nation state or any other cyber group. That's where I would go with it.
Thanks, Bob. Mana, what's your thoughts on that?
I think Bob hit all the key points. I think from what I have seen is the partnership with the government agencies, with the law enforcement agencies is extremely critical. The knowledge sharing that happens between the big tech companies like the Microsofts of the world, the Googles of the world, and the Amazons, like they have significantly bigger infrastructure. When we think about all these IT companies that are the backbone of the internet, there has to be a lot of information sharing between the providers of technology and cloud solutions and networks in general, and law enforcement, and then law enforcement partnering with each of the provinces of the world or any other organization. I think the businesses can do so much. Like we need to build resilience. We need to do all those good things. There's always going to be, as Bob said, the bad guys just have to get it right once. So things will inevitably go wrong at some point of time. It's always a matter of when somebody gets breached. The question is, once that happens, how do you contain it and maintain it? How do you restrict and limit it? How do you respond to it? There are health systems and organizations that get attacked by ransomware. The information needs to be shared. Like there has to be constant sharing of information. Like there are going to be situations where some companies made the right decisions, did not make the right decisions. All of that takes its own course. But things like CISOs sharing information, CISOs making their boards aware about stuff that is happening, CISOs using their power and their network and their influence to build relationships with law enforcement and sharing that information, sharing information with executives at all these tech companies where if something goes wrong, they should be able to reach out to an executive and be like, hey, this is what happened. How do we get all the teams together on a bridge to figure out whether it was an AWS, Azure, network, whatever it is? Communication is going to be the key to addressing a lot of this. And whether it is nation state or just somebody who's doing it for the internet fame, we just need to share that information about what went wrong.
So Bob, let me jump back over to you. So are most cyber attacks sophisticated and complex kinds of attacks, or are most simple and related to human behaviors and mistakes and vulnerabilities? Where do you see that?
I'm going to give you a both answer here, right? I think if you're talking about sheer number of attacks, the most successful attacks, or most of them occur probably because, hackers are able to exploit some level of human error. You either trick people by, revealing their passwords, or they take advantage of some gap or some, gap in a defense that was left open, or some data that was left somewhere that it shouldn't have been left. And I think all of that kind of rolls back to human error. Verizon data breach report, I think it was this year's, it was like over 80% of breaches had somehow include, the human element. The both part of my answer, I think, comes in, that says, once an attacker has kind of gained access to a network or to a database or to a system, at that point, they're going to start using sophisticated tools and techniques to, escalate their privileges, to evade whatever kind of tools and defenses you might have in their detection tools. Obviously, they're going to use tools to reach the data and exfiltrate whatever critical data you might have, or to take control of the system if what their goal is ransom, right? So I think it's a little bit of both. I think a lot of them start with human error, but eventually do end up utilizing sometimes very advanced tools to actually get to the data or to get to owning a system.
So let me address this next question to both Manan and Bob there. Let's talk about IoT and connected devices. We all know that, especially in healthcare, they're proliferating. They're everywhere, and more are just going to be added on a monthly basis even. What vulnerabilities are those bringing into an organization, and how do you deal with that?
I think that's the proliferation of connected devices, especially connected biomedical and medical devices. It presents a very unique risk to any healthcare organization. There are a few big players that manufacture these devices. The reality of it is, we as customers of these devices, we expect and we work with the manufacturers to be like, hey, your devices need to be running on the latest of OSs. There needs to be a good way of providing patches to all these biomedical devices. There needs to be a way for us to monitor all these devices the same way we monitor the rest of the IT infrastructure. And there needs to be a strong element of governance that's provided by the government around these, like stronger regulations for what these devices are that are, as I said, the stakes are lives. These devices are used by people in dire situations, and we should be able to make sure that they can be patched, they can be maintained. And for that, there needs to be a really strong coalition and partnership with the manufacturers, the regulators, and the customers to make sure that who's on the hook for, making sure that these devices are patched. Do we have the right processes? If we need to work and get trained by the manufacturer of these devices, it is on the customer, the healthcare provider, to do that, and then work with the vendor partner to be like, okay, how do we make sure that these devices are always running on the latest OSs, or get the patch, or address the zero-day vulnerabilities? Because the operational aspect of it can often be figured out, like rolling out of patches and all that good stuff can be figured out if some of the fundamentals are understood. Whose roles and responsibility are? Is it in our contract to say that the vendor is going to come and do it? Sure, let's hold the vendor accountable. Is the vendor expecting that, hey, we'll make sure that you know how to do it, but you're the ones who have to do it because it's in your environment and you control the VPN and the network connectivity, so you have to do it. So then our teams should be prepared, and healthcare should be prepared to address that, which talks about an element of partnership with the IT teams within the healthcare organizations. How do we work with the IT teams to make sure those devices are patched? How do we work with the IT teams in the hospitals and the clinics itself physically to, if there is a need to go to the device and do something? So that entire chain needs to be very robust and should be paid attention to a lot, because biomedical devices come more close. Like, you keep getting closer and closer to the patient. Like, the failure of those devices is more close to the patient than a laptop that the doctor is providing, entering the health record on. So as we get closer to the patient, the process needs to be more robust. The partnership needs to be more robust, and everybody needs to understand what is at stake. I think once people understand what is at stake, that's kind of the good thing about healthcare as well. Everybody who's in the healthcare ecosystem has had to go to a doctor, or has had a loved one who's had to go to the hospital. And so they understand what is at stake. So the conversations are easier, but the process part always takes some time to understand and build partnerships. So IoT and biomedical is a huge landscape of threat. There's a lot of work that's being done. There's a lot of work that can be done. If you were to ask from a healthcare perspective, I think everybody feels comfortable in the known IT environment, like the data centers. Where is our PHI, PII? Do we have controls around that? There are so many regulations that govern that everybody's got a little bit of more confidence in how that is protected. But biomedical, I think, is a whole new learning experience for everybody. New devices, cloud-connected devices, and like remotely accessing for a doctor to be able to remotely access a device, get device logs, and all this stuff. There's so much happening that the unknown presents a certain amount of challenges where people are just like, oh, I didn't even know that this was possible. So how do we do biomedical devices? Like, how do we set up the same process of, does a red team or a blue team pen test happen on a device before a manufacturer releases it? How do we periodically keep doing it? So we have to take the same concepts that we were doing from an IT infrastructure perspective and from a product perspective, and now apply that a little bit more rigorously on these devices that are much closer to a patient, and the stakes are high.
So, Bob, your responsibilities are cross industry. So you see healthcare, but you see manufacturing and every other industry. What would you add to that? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I mean, we do see IoT everywhere, right? We see it in manufacturing, we see it in retail, you see it in your home, right? But of all the places that being in the healthcare sector is kind of where I get the most shivers, right? And it's just because of that connection, like I said earlier, between virtual and physical systems. Manan said it, right? In the worst case scenario, somebody's life is at stake with a failure of a device or a compromised device. I mean, everything Manan just said, right, from a healthcare standpoint, applies everywhere else as well. It applies in any industry to know where your devices are and how many you have. You can't protect what you don't know you have. configuration management, right? Not accepting, default configs and, not just taking things as the manufacturer has set them, but, challenging all of that configuration, so that it's not necessarily the open config that came from the provider, from the manufacturer. Sometimes you have to look at it. It's different if it's leased versus owned equipment. Right? The ownership, the responsibility, as Manan said, of who's responsible for that device might be different depending on the situation. But configuration management is clearly one of them. Patch management, we already talked about that. It's a little bit more complex sometimes with firmware and with software on an IoT device. A lot of times it's hard to update. A lot of times things can't be updated as frequently. Same controls apply across industry. But you're absolutely right. In the healthcare sector, it really is acute in terms of the impact. And like you said, Manan, you also have the burning platform, right? You don't necessarily have to explain it and justify it as much as maybe somebody in the manufacturing sector has to, because it's very clear to everybody involved what the risks are.
Man, as you were talking, I had this nightmare vision of early in my career, I was involved in enterprise mobility at the time before iPhones came out. When you updated your mobile device, you had to physically have it in your hand. So, we would either have to go out to the clients and help update their 1,000 barcode scanners or other things. Boy, I'm glad that's not a task we have to deal with anymore. Wow. So as we all know, organizations of all kinds, healthcare and outside, are embracing cloud computing. Let's just talk about, in the area of cloud computing, what are some of the vulnerabilities that introduces into an organization that they really have to pay attention to in ways they didn't have to before?
I think cloud introduces, there's a lot of excitement around cloud, right? Cloud allows people to do things faster and you don't have to install. The deployment is as complex. The reliability aspect is taken away from the IT teams and somebody else's. So there's a lot of excitement around cloud. What ends up happening is it's already on the internet, which means if you don't really tighten every little access there could be, it's very easy for people to go out there and scan. Like there are free websites that people can go put in an address and they can just scan which cloud environment is open, what operating system it's running on. Like you can get all that intelligence for free. Anybody can do it. Anybody who is interested in technology can go and get a list of cloud buckets that are data stores that are easily accessible, which don't have controls. So what ends up happening is if anybody with some free time and interest can, get a list of which cloud data store does not have a password. Now, if you just extend that to somebody with a little bit more motivation and a little bit more interest, the risk is high. So from a cloud perspective, and this is me putting on my consulting hat, coming from those consulting days where it's, just have the basics. Make sure when things are configured, they are configured correctly. It is also on the IT teams to make sure that people often go to cloud services because it's like I swipe a credit card and I'm ready to run something. Now, if the IT teams cannot always be like, hey, I'm going to closely guard this. The cyber teams can't be like, hey, my policy doesn't allow you to do this. People are going to do what people want to do. Everybody wants to show value. They are going to eventually go and buy a domain, swipe their corporate credit card, get an account, and there's a website that's running. You can run WordPress. You can run any of these free content management systems. Now, it is on the IT team. How do they enable the larger enterprise to do all these things in a secure way? It's the IT and the cyber team that have. We have to, again, put ourselves in the shoes of our customers, which are the other teams of the organization, the data-driven teams, the digital teams. They want to move quick. They want to get solutions out there fast. They want to use all these cool cloud technologies. How can IT and cyber work together to have an enterprise standard that says that, hey, if you want to run something on Azure, send this ticket in, we'll create what you want, and you'll be off and running in less than 24 hours. Same with Azure, whatever, like be cloud agnostic and do all those things. The more we do that to enable these people to achieve their goals, the more secure we are. If people are just going to go and start their own cloud accounts and, just start storing data, it's going to be a mess. That is the situation we are in today. I think the IT and cyber teams need to be more understanding of why people want to use cloud and how can IT and cyber work together to enable organizations to adopt cloud in a secure way and in a consistent way. Consistency and security kind of go hand in hand. And so I think it's more on the IT and cyber teams to how to lock this. And then cyber should be scanning the networks all the time to see if there is that one odd data store that's out there that has a lot of sensitive information or doesn't have sensitive information. Like sometimes it's just going to be bad to have your name in the news that somebody found your data online. Now, you also have to keep in mind, like, is it a hotel? Is it your cafeteria menu or is it PHI data that's stored on that data store? So all these things, I think it's more on the IT and cyber teams to understand what are their business objectives. What is the chief digital officer, the chief innovation officer, the CEO? Where are they taking the organization? And how can IT and cyber use cloud to consistently and securely enable that? That's kind of my thought on cloud.
I think you touched on a lot of great points there, right? I mean, with ease and convenience comes a higher level of responsibility, right? It is so easy and convenient and quick to spin up a cloud environment. Cloud containers it's so easy also to misconfigure them. And then thereby they're an attack vector. And then they're on these websites that you mentioned, right? I think it was Gartner that said that 99% of cloud breaches will be somehow a result of misconfiguration or mistake, right? That's the breach angle. And sometimes that's a shared responsibility between you and your cloud vendor, right? So, knowing where the line of demarcation is between what you're responsible for as the client and what your provider is responsible and on the hook for in terms of container security. APIs that you use to connect and access that clients or customers will use to connect and access and manage their data. A lot of times it's those APIs that have the vulnerability. And that's what gets exploited. Just because your data, and I mean, Manan was saying this, right? Just because your data is in somebody else's environment, it's still your data. You've still got to own it. You've still got to ensure permissions and configuration and monitor it and audit it and look for misconfigurations and apply patches and everything that you would normally do. That you have to make sure that's done, whether that's your responsibility or your vendors.
And I think that's to me, it's a very people issue. We as IT enthusiasts, as cyber enthusiasts, it is our responsibility to explain this to the teams and the business stakeholders who are trying to achieve a certain goal. We shouldn't be like, hey, the cyber is everybody's responsibility. So you, person X in this data intelligence team, you're trying to do this. How could you do this? You should have known this. That's not the approach. We should collaborate. We as technology enthusiasts should put ourselves in the shoes of the person who is trying to achieve a certain goal, and how do we enable them? Help them understand that, hey, if you do this, this is your responsibility. A lot of times, when I was in consulting or when I'm in industry, a lot of times people are like, oh, it's cloud. It's somebody else's responsibility. I thought I put it on cloud, so it is their responsibility. And once they realize that that is not the case, they're more than happy to work with the teams to solve it. So I think that falls on people who understand the technology. It is on them to understand and appreciate what somebody in the organization is using something for, and how can we help them to reach and enable their work. IT is always an enabler. So how do we work with people to enable them in a secure and consistent fashion? That, to me, is every cyber and IT person's responsibility. Doesn't matter whether you're an analyst or a CISO. It is on us who understand, appreciate it. We have to put ourselves in the other person's shoe and help them get there. We talk about cybersecurity awareness. To me, that is part of awareness. It's not just like that phishing exercise. It is for us to help folks who engage with technology to help them understand that, these are the implications. And more often than not, when we do that, I've always seen people to be like, oh, now I understand that. How can we work together to do this? How can we do scans? How can we do security tests? How can we do hardware tests? Like, I've always seen, if we reach out from an education and awareness perspective, and more than just being like, you did bad, how could you do this? This is a policy violation. Doesn't really work. I think it is on us to raise that awareness from a cybersecurity perspective.
Just listening to you, Manan, and the skills necessary to do that kind of work, I'm just thinking to myself, those skills must be in high demand. How do you attract a company like Providence? How do you attract the kind of talent into your organization that has those skills? What's the secret?
I think from a Providence perspective, and this is going to be a little bit more of a personal answer. I think from a Providence perspective, Providence is a very mission-driven organization. At the heart of everything we do, we always say that we are here to provide patient care, patient services to the community we serve. As part of that, it is our responsibility to have patient security to be a differentiator, and employee security to be a differentiator for people who walk through the doors of Providence. So there's always an aspect of, I think there are two or three things that come at play when we talk about attracting employees and retaining employees. I think from a healthcare perspective, the cybersecurity challenges and the opportunity to do change and come out with new innovative solutions. I think healthcare offers a lot of that, because digitization in healthcare has been something that is happening at a drastic level. All the big companies are trying to digitize healthcare and come up with innovative solutions. So anybody who's like, I want to do cutting edge stuff, I want to do some interesting, cool stuff, I think is naturally attracted to healthcare, because healthcare is ripe for change, and we are going through that change. The other aspect is, I think what I've started realizing is mission of an organization does matter. We have a lot of people who've been at Providence for like a much longer time than I have. And every time I engage with them and I try to, talk to them and understand their motivations, it always comes back to the mission of Providence that, we are here to serve the community, make sure that our caregivers are in a position to provide the best care, and we provide patients some sort of assurance that if you walk through the doors of Providence, you will get great care, and we will keep your information and data security top of mind. The third, I think, that's become a bigger point of conversation since COVID is cyber has a talent shortage. So we have to make sure that we don't use the same old rules of like, everybody has to be in the office 9 to 5. Cyber teams just don't operate that way. We have to have a follow the sun model. So it's not like everybody has to come into the office. So we have to start appreciating the remote nature of work. We have to start appreciating the cost effectiveness of allowing people to work remotely from different regions and still being able to do the jobs that they love to do and they want to do. So I think mission matters, excitement for the job matters, and an organization that enables people some sort of flexibility, understanding their construct or their constraints, and allowing people to be effective at their job wherever they are within the constraints of, if an organization wants that, hey, we need this team to be in this time zone, that's completely fine. But we still have to keep in mind that the workforce is shifting. We have a shortage, so we will have to be a little bit more flexible in opening doors to people who are not in the same time zone or in different region. So I think it's a combination of these three things that we often have to keep in mind when we're trying to attract and retain talent. And one of these three is always a reason why somebody chooses to work with us or continues to choose to work with us.
Thank you for sharing that, Manan. Now, here at TCS, I have the honor and privilege of being on one of the futurists here at TCS, focused on what's happening in various areas of the world and different industries and different emerging technologies, et cetera. I'm going to ask you guys now to also put on a futurist hat. And if we could just look ahead 5-10 years, how do you think cybersecurity is going to change? How might it look different if we come back here and have this conversation 10 years from now? Bob, let's start with you.
I mean, it's going to evolve, right? So, and it's going to evolve in tandem with the IT systems and the technology and the processes. So as more technology gets developed, our cybersecurity practices are going to evolve. I think a great illustrative point of that is, mobile devices, smartphones and tablets and laptops kind of demand a whole new security approach than what we used to take, right? We used to take this concept of a network perimeter and we harden that. But now with mobile technologies, we have to take more of an endpoint approach. So I think that's one example of how, our security procedures and our approach is going to evolve as the technology changes. I think in general, kind of the migration to cloud storage, cloud computing, whether it's public or private or hybrid or whatever, it's compelling. And it's also going to get people to think more broadly about how the cybersecurity concept is a partnership. It's a shared responsibility between, customer and vendor. And I think that process and that adjustment is going to kind of continue, that it's not an us or them, but it truly is a partnership. I think the costs of breaches and attacks, especially ransomware, we've seen it the last several years. I think the costs and the serious damage that these attacks can cause, especially when we're talking about critical infrastructure or healthcare, I think that's going to lead to a lot more demands from insurance companies, from regulators, from lawmakers, to kind of meet a higher standard. And that's, that directly translates to a higher cost of doing business. But we know that's going to continue to happen. And along with that, I think is that, this kind of goes into the recruiting piece, right? Good cybersecurity is kind of going to be viewed as a competitive advantage or a differentiator with companies. So, a company that, can avoid being in the news, can avoid an attack, or that can recover quickly without, compromising a lot of customer data or privacy, I think at the end of the day gets rewarded by their stakeholders, at least in the short term. And I think that it plays into recruiting as well, right? People, everybody's got their way to attract talent. As Manan said, his is very mission driven. Part of that is not being a target, right? Part of that is being able to demonstrate that we're prioritizing these things, because people in our field, they want to work for an organization that prioritizes what we think is important. The other final, I guess, the trend I would say is I'm encouraged to see a lot more universities developing cybersecurity as a focus area, as a major, as a discipline. It's 5-10 years ago there were a handful of universities that were offering degrees in this space, and now there's a lot more. So I think that trend is going to continue. That's just purely being driven by market demand. Universities know what diplomas get hired and which ones don't, and they're putting focus on the high demand spaces. So I think those are kind of 4 or 5 areas that I see.
I think I agree with what listed out. I do think that what's going to end up happening is there is a shift in healthcare. Like if I talk about healthcare specifically, there is a shift in healthcare where we want to offer healthcare to the patient where the patient is, instead of having everybody to come into the hospital or the clinic to get healthcare. We want to reach out to where the patients are, or where the person who needs healthcare is. We're seeing that in countries like India, where medicines are being provided to the person. Where if you go to India and when you wanted a blood test or if you wanted a COVID test, there would be somebody who would come to your house, collect the sample, send you the report. So we are seeing a trend where, as Bob was saying, that that perimeter is shifting, and as that perimeter expands, the threat landscape expands. The talent for cybersecurity needs to adapt and needs to understand where the industry is going and what new trends and what new cyber threat vectors can come up, and how do we adapt to that. So that means that the education curriculum will help with that. Right now, when cyber started like a decade or so ago, it was like a lot of audit mindset. Like, we have controls. Are you meeting the control? Are you not meeting the control? Then it evolved to, how do we build a strategy? How do we implement more intelligence into implementing the control and testing the control? There's a lot more automation. So there's going to be a lot more automation from a cybersecurity perspective. Now that we have all these logs that we get, we analyze logs, we analyze how to review code. And so a lot of that operational work is going to get automated. At the same time, we'll have to adapt cybersecurity to meet the business needs as businesses evolve and change. And in healthcare, it's getting closer to the patient. Instead of everybody coming into one hospital for care, we are expanding to where the patients are. So we'll have to adapt to that. There's going to be a lot of automation. I think AI will start playing a lot more proactive role in augmenting what the individuals do today, like the eyes on glass monitoring. To me, it's automation. If an artificial intelligence and algorithm is giving us an alert, it's kind of sort of like automation. So automation is going to really change how cybersecurity operations are done. The engineering talent across IT and across business is getting more aware of cybersecurity. Ransomware impacts everybody. Nobody can say that, hey, ransomware is a cyber thing, cyber team, go fix it. If there is a ransomware, everybody is impacted in the organization. So people are getting more aware of it. They're getting smarter about it. So there is a lot of hope that more people will be aware. Threats will evolve. Bad guys will evolve their tactics. But I think as we introduce automation, as we increase the education that is provided, I think we'll be able to deal with the new threats. And I take a more optimistic approach to things. So I'd like to believe that we'll meet the new threats of the future as they come.
Manan, Bob, I want to thank you so much for taking time on this Friday afternoon to share your insights and wisdom with all of us. Thank you so much for being on the program.
Thank you. This was a great thought-provoking discussion, as I said. Really appreciate everybody from your team kind of organizing this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, Manan.